Good morning, everyone. We're just going to give it a minute for everyone to filter in. Thank you all for joining us this morning. All right, so we can go ahead and get started. So good morning again, and thank you for joining us today for Empowerment, Engagement, and Inclusion, a cultural, linguistic, and trauma-informed comprehensive approach to supporting marginalized youth in commercial sexual exploitation programming. My name is Charlotte Hoff, and I am the Communications and Training Coordinator here at MOVA. I'm just going to go over a few logistics before I pass it over to the presenters today. This is a Zoom webinar, so you cannot be seen or heard as audience members, but you are able to see the presentation, the presenters, and the ASL interpreters. There will be time at the end for questions, so if you have any questions throughout the presentation, please feel free to use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen to ask those, and we'll get to all of them at the end of the presentation. We do have ASL interpreters and CART captioning available during today's workshop. To see the closed captioning, click on the up arrow next to closed captioning at the bottom of the screen and choose show subtitle. If you're having trouble seeing the ASL interpreters, closed captions, or any other tech or logistics issues, please message either myself or my colleague Brenna Chase, and we'll be happy to help you. If you don't see either of our names, you can just message all panelists in the chat function, and we can help you from there. Stephanie Bandu began her journey at the Center for Hope and Healing as a Healing Corps volunteer in 2018, providing hotline and medical advocacy to survivors of sexual assault. She later joined the Lowell Commercial Sexual Exploitation Task Force as a research fellow and has since expanded her passion for working with at-risk youth and survivors of human trafficking. Adriana Castrillion-Reyes joined the Center for Hope and Healing in July of 2017, where she uses art and play to empower survivors. As the Lowell Ending Trafficking of Youth counselor and advocate, Adriana regularly provides support to minors of sexual assault and exploitation through individual and group counseling sessions. Thank you, Stephanie and Adriana, for being here today, and I'll pass it over to you both now.
Thank you so much, Charlotte. Thank you. Hello, everyone. As Charlotte mentioned, my name is Stephanie Bandu. I'm the Lowell Ending Trafficking of Youth Project Director from the Center for Hope and Healing. And I have the pleasure of working with my colleague here today, Adriana, which I'll give her a moment to go ahead and introduce herself and say hello.
Good morning. Thank you, everyone, for being here. As Stephanie mentioned, my name is Adriana Castrillion-Reyes, and I am the Let Youth Counselor Advocate.
Thank you for that, Adriana. And I would also like to introduce Nani, our Survivor Services Manager from the Center for Hope and Healing, who wasn't able to be here today as she's hosting another webinar. And our organization would like to divide and conquer and spread awareness to all this information. And to also get started, we would like to thank the Office for Victims the Massachusetts Office for Victims Assistance in hosting this Victims' Rights Month long workshop, including our own titled Empowerment, Engagement, and Inclusion, a cultural, linguistic, and trauma-informed approach to supporting marginalized youth in commercial sexual exploitation programming. I know it's a mouthful, but we will be sharing tons of information with you today. Before we get started, I wanted to bring to your attention that this workshop will highlight our Lowell Ending Trafficking of Youth program, which you will often hear me refer to as the Let Youth program, and some best practices through our own internal programming here at the Center for Hope and Healing, our visions and full frame approach of being inclusive in the work that we do. We rely on our partnerships with local and federal organizations, law enforcement, also youth serving organization, community members, and families of survivors to all work together to be able to provide these comprehensive services. Although at the Center for Hope and Healing, we know our expertise, we also know our limits, and work collaboratively with partners across county and across states to address the needs of survivors, especially survivors of CSEC. So to tell you a little bit about the Center for Hope and Healing, we have been around for over 45 years, providing prevention, education services, intervention services, and advocacy in the Merrimack Valley or in the Greater Lowell area. Today, with a staff of 17, we are fairly small but mighty, and 30 active volunteers. CHH serves the Lowell and 13 other surrounding communities. CHH mission and vision is fundamentally rooted in eliminating sexual violence and reducing the impact of oppression for communities who have historically been excluded in service delivery, such as children and youth, young men of color, and also the LGBTQ youth. Our Hope Prevent team, as you can see, right there, provide community organizing, outreach and education, workshops, and they work alongside of young people to bring awareness and do facilitate workshop on topics on like healthy relationship, self and identity that are directly linked to their lived experiences. And also our survivor services team, with the help of our Healing Corps volunteer, provide hotline, a 24-hour hotline, and we also provide individual counseling, psychoeducational and psychosocial support group, medical and legal advocacy. Our web chat in this digitized world allow increased access and allow survivors to reach out to us and also do so anonymously if that's what they choose to do. And then lastly, we have our Traffic Minors program, our Lowell Ending Trafficking of Youth program at CHH that provides services for minors who are either at risk or are survivors of CSEC who are under 18. All of our services are free and confidential. So to begin today's presentation, Adriana will spend some time identifying the barriers to working with marginalized youth who are vulnerable to sexual violence, specifically CSEC. We'll also talk about some best practices to working with youth who are usually left at the margin, using a cultural, linguistic, and survivor-centered approach to promote inclusion in services. And lastly, we'll close the presentation with some resources of other organizations in Massachusetts and also across county who are doing this work. And we will also share an activity with you all to bring all that information that we'll be sharing together. So let's begin. So what is commercial sexual exploitation? So CSEC is a form of child sexual abuse where there is a swap of something valuable to the child and the perpetrator preys on the child's vulnerability. CSEC is not delinquency. CSEC is not Girls Gone Wild, and CSEC is not promiscuity. The average age a teen enters the sex trade in the US is about 12 to 14 years old, and sometimes even younger. An understanding of the continuum of violence, abuse, and exploitation is a key part to learning more about CSEC. Knowing what makes young people vulnerable in our society allows us to actually target the root causes of sexual violence and exploitation in the first place. So often that continuum begins, right, with child sexual abuse. And child sexual abuse, the way that children experience abuse is usually under the disguise of secrecy, love, or attention. This leads the survivor to be confused about loyalty, love, and abuse. And we know that these experiences of abuse have long-term effect and impact on survivors. So some of the impact may be they may have low self-esteem, they are feeling guilty and shame after the assault, and children often do not disclose, right? As denial is the common reaction due to coercion or fear of not being believed. The other piece that contribute to this continuum of abuse is the rape culture. Rape culture promotes all forms of violence. For instance, language like, if you dress like that, then what do you think is going to happen? Or implying that a survivor was asking for it or just wanted attention. Black and brown children face adultification and hypersexualization in the media, which leads to false assumption that they are more sexual than their counterparts. They call them fast and late term. So this is really important for us to be able to know and understand that hardships and also risk factors and vulnerabilities lead young people, right, to be vulnerable to exploitation in CSEC. So CSEC, like any other form of sexual violence, is about power and control, right? So that unequal power dynamic between an adult and a child relationship. So perpetrators use their power to be able to control young people who are dependent on them or who, again, is at a lower power status than them. So perpetrators can also be friends, families, or neighbors of young people. And they use a tool called grooming, right? So grooming help offenders to gain access, sets up the relationship that is grounded in secrecy so that the crime is less likely to be discovered. So right now on social media, human trafficking has high demand in our society, right? Economic hardship, as Adri will talk about, will lead to instability that makes youth more vulnerable. So since the pandemic started, we are online at work, we're going to school at work, and even most of our social life actually happen on the social platform. Perpetrators have been adapting to this new normal and targeting youth, which means that it's even more important for youth to stay safe online. I also would like to bring your awareness to the spectrum of sexual exploitation. If the sex industry were a continuum, on one side, we'll have adult men and women who are knowing and willing participant in prostitution, whether that is through direct exploitation or because of poverty or abuse, or even by choice. They use prostitution as a means of income to be able to survive. On the other end of the spectrum, however, is where I would like to bring your focus on, to the minors, right? Those who are forced into the sex industry against their will because of some measure of fraud or some measure of coercion or even force. So there is a broad expanse of just shade of gray, right? The line between choice and force between the sex industry and human trafficking. That line is usually really hard to detect. However, for today's workshop, I want to point your attention to CSEC minors under 18 cannot consent to sex no matter the gender. Words and language matter so much in conversation of CSEC that youth that are involved in the sex trade are exploited. And this matter because using the wrong word to describe someone's experiences means that they're left unseen and can also lead to further experiences of discrimination. So if it is a child, it is not prostitution, it is not sex work, it is child sexual exploitation. So I would like to talk a little bit about CSEC in Massachusetts. Human trafficking is the fastest growing criminal industry in the world today, as I mentioned earlier. It is often operated by and organized by crime of different syndicates. One popular myth that most often that people believe is that trafficking only happens in third world countries. Well, that is indeed a myth and a misconception because there are over 50,000 people who are trafficked in the US every single year. In the state of Massachusetts, between 2007 to 2019, the National Human Trafficking Hotline report for Massachusetts have received over 2,976 calls. And some of these cases were identified to either be moderate or high risk. Additionally, in the year of 2019, the National Trafficking Hotline received 349 contacts, and 107 of these contacts were cases of human trafficking. And out of the 107 cases of human trafficking, 80 of these were sex trafficking cases that involve women and children. So if we really think of it, CSEC does not only happen to women and females, but they also happen to men and boys. But we know that those numbers are underreported because of identification or disclosure is really low. The amplified impact of COVID-19 across the world have really created economic hardship that increased the risk of sex trafficking. And it also inhibit identification, right, of all of the youth who are trafficked. I often point out that inside is not safe for all of us. The isolation brought by the pandemic have left some survivors of sex trafficking to be inside with their abusers and perpetrators, and they are often disconnected from resources that could identify, from resources that will be able to provide support for them. And we also know that these numbers, we can see in the map here, all of the places where trafficking or sex trafficking is happening in Massachusetts, but we know that these numbers do not account for the sex trafficking or exploitation that happens online. Sex trafficking online is on the rise, and Adriana will talk a little bit about social media and safety, right? But we know that perpetrators can contact young people on TikTok, Snapchat, and all of the different social media platforms that we now have, and promise them safety on the screen, right? And begin the grooming process, exploiting their vulnerabilities. So now I am going to give it away to Adriana so she can, actually I have one more slide. Let's talk a little bit about the different vulnerabilities that I mentioned earlier. Although people believe that only bad kids get trafficked, any vulnerable youth can be trafficked. That can be also a target of sex trafficking. That's all genders, any economic class, any race, any education level. But CSEC does disproportionately affect young people who are financially poor, youth of color, immigrants and refugees, LGBTQ youth, children who are homeless, youth who are involved in the child welfare system, or youth who have an experience of child sexual abuse or domestic violence, or have even witnessed it vicariously in their family. All of these populations are the most vulnerable for sex trafficking. Like I mentioned earlier, CSEC uses power and control, whether that is through coercion and threats, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, the chains that we often think about, right, when we watch movies such as Taken, those are really mental chains. Perpetrators use this power dynamic to be able to manipulate young people, right, create dependence on them, and also isolate them from their resources. And now I will pass it on to Adriana to talk a little bit about the barriers with serving marginalized communities.
Thank you, Stephanie. Yes, so as Stephanie was speaking about earlier, COVID has definitely had an impact on CSEC. When working with youth, similar to adapting to language to better communicate with, serve, understand them, we also need to adapt to just the times. That being said, COVID has been around for over a year now, and it surely has had an impact on CSEC. The slide you can see has some data collected in 2018. 87.7% of trafficking cases in 2018 were internet-based, and 43% involved online recruitment. So those studies haven't been done precisely for the impacts of COVID on CSEC. With the numbers of 2018 in mind, we definitely think that recruitment has increased, online recruitment has increased. We also need to understand that children have different and sometimes greater access during these times. a lot of families that didn't have computers, tablets, internet access due to the times schools maybe gave them a computer. I know our organization, for example, helped some people out with tablets. So some children that maybe weren't spending as much screen time at home are now having more access. So we're going to move on. Another thing that as providers we need to keep in mind is the evolution of technology and apps. I think about myself growing up and I solely had AIM, and then MySpace came around and finally Facebook. But I think about my internet usage as a child, and it really was one site or one app at a time besides my games. But social interaction through apps really was one at a time. Nowadays, children have multiple apps. They have a lot of apps where they have access to people that they've never met and people have access to them. We need to think about the fact that perpetrators are using the same technology and sites that you and I use just to buy a bike or anything else. And the usage of these sites make it easier for children both to be sold and bought. A lot of these social network sites like Snapchat can also make it easier to find locations. So a lot of people might not be aware, but unless you turn off the location, it just automatically shows it. And therefore perpetrators can kind of keep track of where children oftentimes hang out, where you can find them. And that way it's easier to kind of target them. There's also the idea of being able to have some sextortion or cyberbullying. I don't know how many of you are familiar with TikTok, but TikTok, for example, facilitates a space for grooming internationally. And with all the different challenges that they have, and by challenge, I mean TikTok challenges. There was, for example, recently a red light silhouette one where people would dance as a silhouette with the red light in back of them in a door frame, and it made them look sexy, right? And what a lot of people didn't understand is that the filter could be reversed. And some of these youth were doing the challenge with minimal or no clothing. And then the filter was reversed and now everything could be seen. Now this could be used against them, right? So there's a lot of safety that needs to be brought up around technology usage and children. And the issue is that we cannot arrest our way out of this problem. Law enforcement simply doesn't have enough resources to navigate the massive online sex market to find the children and identify their traffickers. So Stephanie and I took a training that was provided by My Life, My Choice. And one of the things that they spoke about was that the top 3 biggest crimes in the Black market were number 1, drugs, number 2, commercial sex, and number 3, gun trade. And it's incredible to think about the fact that it's easier to trade people than it is guns at this moment. So we're going to do a little activity. I know we can't interact in the way that we would like to, but just to keep in mind. So based solely on this square that you're seeing, where am I? And what does this room look like? What do you think it looks like? Am I in a bedroom, an office, the basement, the kitchen, living room? And who's around me? What's around me? And do I look healthy right now to you? And do I look safe? And why is this important? Why am I even asking you this, bringing this up? So with the idea that right now, so many things are virtual, we need to keep in mind that things go far beyond what we can actually see. As Stephanie mentioned earlier, a lot of the chains in CSEC are mental, and a lot of perpetrators allow the children to go to school and live their quote unquote normal life And after school is when they're being bought or sold, and that's not always the case for everything, but we have seen that mental chains are the biggest chains. So with that said, I'll clarify, I'm in my office, but with that said, you can't see beyond this square, and someone can very well be sitting next to me. Just like with children, their perpetrator could be sitting on the bed next to them, and they might be allowed to go to class just to not raise suspicion. In terms of, do I look healthy? You can't see if I look tired, if I haven't slept in days, if I have marks on me, because on top of the fact that I'm solely in a box, these online platforms allow for filters, and Zoom itself has a touch up my appearance filter, where maybe I don't look as tired. You also can't see the social interaction between peers that you often were able to see in person during school or after school programs. The way that children interact with each other, the conversations you overhear oftentimes are what, raise red flags. A lot of the physical signs that we previously saw, maybe a tattoo branding, or maybe they're coming in with new phones all the time, whatever the case, we can't see. And we also need to keep in mind that just because a child is present in class, and I'm speaking solely attendance, it does not mean that they're engaged. They can be on, camera off, and we don't know who's around them, what's going on, if they're in harm. So this is just important when thinking about our programming, when thinking about how we come up with groups, what guidelines we provide around them to make sure that we're being able to really provide the best services and safety for children. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about other barriers. I think I'm going to start off with just an example to tie it all in. And this is a case that is specifically from our agency. We worked with a family that it was a mother of 4. The mother and the children and father were crossing the border together. The father got separated during the border crossing. And as soon as the mother and the children got to the United States, they had interaction with ICE. The mother had no documentation, and children, no documentation, no English, no job, no true supports. And because of this, the person that they ended up living with found a quote unquote boyfriend for the oldest daughter, who was 17. She would require this boyfriend, who was a 30-something or 40-year-old married man, to therefore help with bills and rent because his girlfriend lived in this household. She would also oftentimes, when the mother did find a job, she was gone all day. Since she had no transportation, she relied on people to bring her and pick her up whenever they could. So she was mainly out. There wasn't a lot of supervision. And the person that found this boyfriend would then require the oldest daughter to go to her boyfriend's house when they needed money. Now that she's no longer 17, but now she has a baby by this person. So we need to keep in mind that this type of, we just need to think about how certain barriers put a youth or anyone at a higher risk of exploitation. And also the fact that this data is limited, so we need to think additionally about it. There's a lot of underreporting just because of fear. Maybe the person doesn't have the adequate language to be able to speak out what's happening. And depending on what type of interaction they've had with authority or different power dynamics, they might not feel ready or willing to speak. So We're gonna just move on to the next slide. And I'm gonna just continue to tie back this example because it just is an example that really has everything in it. African American and Latino youth are overrepresented in child sex trafficking cases. So as I mentioned, we need to identify what type of situations have these children gone through, and think about intersectionality. Not only was the person that I was speaking about young, Latina, undocumented, lower socioeconomic status, there was so much that really put them at a higher risk. So if we think about, she's the oldest in the family of 4, and mom is out all day working, and we still can't fully make ends meet. And if someone's offering me money and willing to help my family, and I know that we need that, I'm going to be more willing to perhaps think that it's a good idea to receive this help and so on. And then on top of that, if services by our agencies are being provided to these youth, we say, okay, we'll help you with counseling. Well, are we providing them with transportation? Because they don't have the means to get here. They don't have the money to get an Uber, or maybe they just live in an area that's difficult. On top of that, they might be taking care of their younger siblings. Are we willing to provide childcare or any other type of thing to be able to really allow this youth to fully take advantage of the services and support that we're providing? So just because we are providing services, it doesn't mean that they're accessible. And that's something to constantly think about as youth workers. With the child welfare system, when providing services, like I said, we need to be able to identify the barriers to properly approach and interact with children. We need to build rapport. Studies have shown that 50 to 90% of child sex trafficking victims have been involved in the child welfare system. So the biggest thing to keep in mind is that instability creates opportunity. If a child doesn't feel supported and feels like they really have no one or anything, and someone's approaching them and, I'll be your friend, oh, we can go to the movies, whatever the case, it's a lot easier to build a bond with a child that's vulnerable. And with that, the same training that Steph and I took in My Life, My Choice, they gave the example of someone approaching a child to build a bond, to then be able to groom them. And perhaps they see that the child has to walk their younger sister to school, and they say, I'll take you. And then it gets to the point where maybe the person says, oh, I need you to do this or this and that. And the child says, no, I don't want to. And say, okay, well, now I know where your sister goes to school. I've dropped you off after school, so I know where you live. And then it becomes a thing of power and control to be able to use the child. But I'll mention it again, instability creates opportunity. And that's the same case with LGBTQ youth. Now, if we're thinking about instability, we also need to address overall supports. It's not just physical. It's not, they gave me a roof over my head, they're giving me food. It's emotional. 40% of homeless youth are LGBTQ. And oftentimes LGBTQ traffic victims are often overlooked, and it's often underrepresented. And this might be because of fear of not being believed, because of their gender identity or sexual orientation. And another thing to often think about is that youth that have to engage in unwanted sexual acts to meet their basic needs is not prostitution. As Stephanie mentioned, someone that's under 18 cannot give consent. And on top of that, there's a big difference with needing to meet basic needs. The type of language we use when referring to youth, when working with youth, as Stephanie mentioned, is very important. And homelessness is a clear risk factor that increases the chances of exploitation. Just once again, instability creates opportunity. Okay. And now I'm just gonna pass it back to Stephanie for an overview.
Thank you, Adriana. So Adriana just highlighted a few populations, right, that we're talking about who have been historically excluded out of services, whether that is because of a language barrier, whether it is that we cannot effectively and appropriately meet their cultural needs, whether it is around their sexual identity or around just racial and gender identity, who continue inequities that continues to push these youth further at the margin. All of these vulnerabilities that she mentioned have, have definitely disconnected and disengaged youth from services. Marginalized youth already have limited connection in community programming and services, and that disconnection creates an even bigger gap in disengagement. I love that example that Adriana mentioned earlier of just because a young person is attending school online, right? They're on the screen, they log in, doesn't mean that they're engaged. And the same thing as oftentimes services are mandated and families who are trying to make ends meet, just they're like, this is literally the least that I can do, so let's go ahead and do it. So they might be engaged in services, but oftentimes providers have limited connection with them, right? Or limited rapport. We'll talk a little bit about the relationship being the intervention, right? Wherever you may be joining us from whatever organization, as a youth serving provider or someone who provide direct services to young people, the implications of disengagement. And also, this exclusion and disengagement can result in fragmented service delivery that often lack the necessary support to appropriately meet the needs of this young person, and actively disrupt or help the young person heal. We know that healing from any type of sexual violence is not linear. It is definitely a roller coaster. So survivors, on top of all of these barriers that they face, do have the additional burden of multiple intersecting identities of theirs, creating unique experiences for them in communities. So looking at the role of culture, right? Culture is so important. It is not a one size fits all. Meeting someone exactly where they're at, knowing their cultural background. Language is such a barrier that not being able to have services in your own language just empowered survivors, right? Because then they have to depend on someone to be the voice. So a lot of the work that we do is uplifting the voice of survivors and increasing access by eliminating some of the barriers, like providing services in languages that are their own, that are their first languages, and also utilizing survivor-centered approach, right, for providing comprehensive services. The survivors are the expert of their lives, and oftentimes we talk about that in our clinical spaces of being the buoy for survivors, right? Being the buoy that supports them and not necessarily going and drowning in the water with them, and being that force that just lend a hand and support them to make decisions on their own, support them to guide their comprehensive services. So some of the barriers that may even tint our perceptions are, again, stereotype and misperception of the language that we use to talk about sexual violence, right? The language that we use with children, the things that are taboo for us to talk about, but yet they are exposed to it, whether within their friend circles, whether it is through social media, or whether it is on television. Lack of training opportunities is another barrier as providers that we all face. We all know about the impacts of sexual violence, but human trafficking specifically and CSEC particularly are fairly new right? This conversation has been more of a trend in social media, more of a trend in our nation than something that we address as a pandemic within this pandemic that we're experiencing currently. So training opportunities to continue to build awareness around these topics are extremely vital. Also, competing priorities. Um, Youth specifically have a lot of competing priorities. If you remember earlier, all of the different risk factors I mentioned, whether that is homelessness, whether that is a barrier around language, whether that is involvement in the child welfare, whether that is poverty, all of these different barriers are competing priorities. And for people of color, especially youth of color, right, that continues to push their needs at the margin. And the lack of disclosure is something else that we've talked about earlier as a barrier, and really thinking about the relationship being the intervention and working with young people. The goal is not disclosure, right? The goal is to be able to build rapport, provide safe spaces for them to be able to be their full self. And also representation. Representation matters so much in this work because young people, as Adriana will tell you, as she has worked very closely with a lot of youth, that they can see you coming from a mile away. So they know exactly what to expect. They know exactly what you're thinking and feeling. So it's so important to be able to build these relationships and build rapport with the young people that we're working with. And also, there are a lot of potential and perceived complication around mandated reporting. Transparency is so key to this work and being genuine and expressing those concerns to youth. I'll talk a little bit about the best practices in a little bit about what it is like to work with survivors and make sure that everything that we're doing is attached to their lived experiences. Our expectation, I always say, is not their reality. Just because we expect something doesn't mean that's what their reality is at the moment. So really just thinking about their full selves. So now I will actually skip this slide and I will come back to it. But I want to talk a little bit about intersectionality. Why does it matter? Right? We've been talking about all of the different factors that continue to make youth more vulnerable to CSEC, whether they're a racial minority, whether they belong to the LGBTQ community, whether they're from a different nationality or have a disability. All of these different things interact together to create a unique experiences. None of these identities exist in a bubble or in a vacuum alone, right? They all overlap. So for every single identity, it creates a complex experience for that youth that we need to be able to take into account these multiple forms of exclusion that young people face every single day. So intersectionality really helps us to ensure that we aren't overlooking the challenges belonging to people with multiple minority identities, right? As we move towards a more equitable society and equitable services. And it also helps us to become better advocates, right? An advocate that really meet the survivor where they're at, that builds rapport with the young person and allows them to be able to drive their treatment and express their needs and their goals. So I have this graphic that I believe mirrors so well what we talk about in intersectionality, right? The top graphic is saying, I don't know you guys what you guys are complaining about. If you want to make it through, just be yourself. Well, it is not a one size fits all, right? Unfortunately. So I would like for all of you to think about, how does intersectionality impact the work you do with your own clients? Are you seeing only one side of their identity? Are those the identities that are most present or that you're most comfortable with, right? How can intersectionality, to really think about including intersectionality in your work, right? And how it will help you better understand the whole person before you and not just aspect of their identity. Youth of color continue to face discrimination and are more likely to experience poverty. And like Adriana have mentioned over and over again, instability creates opportunities, right? So we cannot ignore the legacy of racialized and gendered violence in our nation, which continue to contribute to the trafficking of vulnerable population. Inclusion and being anti-racist is one way to prevent sex trafficking and also to be able to support young people. So now we will go back to that activity that I skipped earlier. I want you to consider this. Consider that you're a small business owner on Main Street, because wherever you are in Massachusetts, there is a Main Street. You see a young person hanging outside your business, smoking a cigarette, wearing provocative clothing, and talking on a cell phone. Again, I'm going to read that as I can talk a little bit fast sometimes. You're a small business owner on Main Street. You see a young person hanging outside your business, smoking a cigarette, wearing provocative clothing, and talking on a cell phone. I know you're not able to interact with me right now, but I know that after reading this small scenario, you're thinking of a person. Who do you picture? Is it someone older? Maybe a youth between they're 16, 17? Or do you picture a much younger youth, maybe 10 to 14? What was their gender? Did you think about their gender identity? Do you often think, because right, the scenario mentioned someone wearing provocative clothing. Did you paint a picture of a young female standing outside of your store or a young male? Or are you thinking of a youth with that outside of the gender binary, right? What were they wearing? When we think about provocative clothing, what do we think? Do we think short shorts and short skirts? Or do you think maybe their pants are sagging, right? What do you picture as provocative clothing? Or what words would you use to describe them? Are you describing them as the young person who's outside of your business, that maybe they're alone, they're homeless? Are you describing them as a fast child, a bad child, right? That you do not want in front of your business? So again, this exercise matter because of intersectionality, right? That there are so many different identity perspectives that interact together to create a whole person. So thinking about this person's age, their race, that was one thing. Did you picture a youth of color, a white youth, right? All of these different factors combine together to create a unique experience of how we serve and also how we support our youth. So now I will go ahead and move along to talking about why engagement and inclusion, right? Why is this important? Well, earlier we mentioned that the lack of resources and capacity to be able to provide resources for youth who are at risk or maybe survivors of human trafficking or sex trafficking. Many CSEC youth may not be identified as affected, like I mentioned, or even though that they are being trafficked, right? Maybe you're working with a youth and you're like, they're the difficult one, right? They just want attention. They're always being bad. But this young person might actually be, there might be at risk for trafficking, or there might be a survivor themselves, right? Mandated reporting can be so deterrent to disclosure, and often the reporting agencies are not able to adequately respond in a trauma-informed way, a way that's centered, the youth who is indeed impacted. And again, because of all these competing demands and competing priorities, right? A lot of time, the trauma-informed approaches usually take a seat, and the youth are investigated, right? And having these conversations over and over, like I mentioned earlier, can provide further victimization. Also, many CSEC youth, as Adrienne mentioned earlier, are involved in many systems, including the child welfare, the juvenile justice system, mental health systems that are often not coordinated in responding to CSEC. and also may not be aware that the youth that they are providing services for is being trafficked. So there is a huge gap in consensus among providers to be able to serve and support vulnerable youth. So collaboration is so key, and being able to connect with the other people who are providing services for that young person, and making sure that those services are inclusive, they're survivor centered, and they're also culturally relevant. Also, there is a difficulty in being able to, young people experience a difficulty in gaining the trust of providers, right? In order to establish like a rapport with them and feel safe in disclosing, right? Many youth who are involved in the system have, faced or experienced mistrust or distrust, right? There is someone who have betrayed their trust, someone who probably was not completely transparent with them, right? And especially when they are involved in the system, if they have any ties with their family, a lot of times we cannot work alone with youth and not work with their families, because that's also widening the gap in services. So a lot of times they fear that their families might be in trouble. Again, like Adriana mentioned, perpetrators do prey and groom youth. That process is not a one and done. It is a continuous process. So they really figure out what are the vulnerabilities that they indeed prey on. So it's really important for us to think about the nature of the comprehensive services that we do provide. Like I mentioned earlier, our Lowell Ending Trafficking of Youth program is really a collaborative and survivor-centered approach. We work with multiple agencies and youth serving organization within the state or within our county in the Greater Lowell area to be able to provide those services. We know that it takes a village to do this work, and we cannot respond. One provider cannot take care of all those needs alone. So utilizing trauma-informed approach for all survivors is extremely important. Again, meeting them where they're at, allowing them to be the expert, empowering them in the process of treatment. I always, whenever I get together with a young person, I usually tell them, like, you're the expert, you're going to teach me. And as Adriana and I continue to facilitate groups, a lot of times our debriefs are, oh my gosh, did you know about this? We always learn something new, and young people always teach us something new. Language are evolving, so much are evolving, and their experiences as well. And also language-based marginalization is another type of discrimination, like I mentioned earlier, that continues to widen the gap, right? Making it very difficult for survivors whose English is not their first language to navigate and operate the system. So it's really important for us to consider all the languages in our area, consider the different communities who live in that particular area, and being able to provide the appropriate linguistic services for them. And we at the Center for Hope and Healing are able to provide sustainable services like 24-hour support for survivors through our hotline that I mentioned earlier is covered and staffed by our staff, no pun intended, and our volunteers, and build this long-term relationship, right? The rapport might happen through a hotline call. It might happen through our web chat, in which we, again, survivors can reach us anonymously for services if they wish to, and also being able to sustain that services, whether it is through groups. I personally tell my survivors the relationship that we're building is a sustainable relationship, because although they graduate and they go on with their lives, right, we do check in every so often. One of the most rewarding thing I feel for me in counseling with young people is getting a text or an email later on and saying, hey, this thing happened, this one thing we're working on, or hey, I am looking for this service, who would you recommend? Again, empowering them to make these decisions and seek relevant access to resources on their own. So our Let Youth program really work collaboratively by creating different spaces, whether that is our steering committee that leads the work, our interagency case assessment that is really dedicated to be able to identify and work with at-risk youth. Our community awareness and education is so important. Like Adri mentioned, we have to be very mindful of the different platforms that perpetrators are using to prey and exploit young people, and use the same platform to educate. I know myself, I have learned one too many things on TikTok. So using these different platforms to be able to raise awareness. So just an overview of consent is so important, especially when we're working with a youth who have an experience of assault. We know that the power dynamic within those relationships of violence, right, take away the control from the youth. So really just making sure that the services that we are providing, that the survivor gives us consent to bring in other people into their case, consent for them to receive the services, and also allowing them. I always have a keyword that I use with my survivor, whether it's chicken or blue or sky, that they then tell me to let me know that, you know what, I want to put that on pause or not right now. Because oftentimes they may not have language to be able to communicate it. But the best way that we can uplift their voices is making sure that we encourage them to be a part of, right, all the services, to be a part of the services that we're providing for them, to meet them where they're at. And also to make sure that the services that we are providing for them is directly linked to their lived experiences and are centering their lived experiences. Again, like Adriana mentioning, and creating either one-on-one or even in the group space, thinking about the guidelines of the group, right? How would you engage young people, especially virtually? We know that it's hard. Zoom burnout is real. We all face that, right? But being able to think about how we can engage young people and also be collaborators with them, empowering them to be able to make their own decisions. So by eliminating language barrier, that's a great way to be able to empower a survivor to reach out, for whatever service that they need on their own, or maybe with a little bit of your assistance. You know, self-efficacy is so important, that they can do it. A lot of survivors, again, because of everything that they've experienced in the system, the mistrust and distrust, are reluctant to, you know, advocate on their own or seek out services on their own. So self-efficacy is very crucial. And lastly, I would like to point out our full frame approach. Full frame, we use this approach at the Center for Open Healing to really think about stability, access to meaningful and relevant resources with survivors, to also think about like all of the different facets of their lives, right? And this full frame approach, again, is very intersectional in nature and allows us to see and work with survivors within their full selves. And now I will pass it on again to Adriana to talk to you a little bit about the relationship.
Thank you, Stephanie. So as Stephanie has mentioned throughout, building rapport is very, very important. What youth workers need to understand is that the relationship is definitely the intervention. Being able to center and uplift survivor voices is so important, and have them truly feel like they're being understood and believed and listened to, heard. A lot of youth are oftentimes told what they need, what to do, what time to be here, what time to go there. And to be able to have someone say, what do you need? And how can I help you? And I know you went through a lot, and that's okay. Like, how can we now move on? As youth workers, we need to address the subculture and reframe the economic strategy. Oftentimes, I think about how a lot of individuals kind of get wrapped up in this because of needs. Once again, tying back the example I gave earlier, being able to help the family provide, being able to support in some way. Well, what if we as organizations provide that? What if we as organizations provide groups where they're receiving stipends, where we provide some sort of economic help I know, for example, our organization received a COVID relief grant where we were able to provide at time of need. And if more organizations are able to do that, we're able to put a person in a situation where maybe they're not as high of a risk because they are being able to get support, not only emotionally, but physically, all types of support by exterior organizations. We also need to develop partnerships and know systems. If perhaps we aren't able to provide something, who can I connect you to? If I don't speak this language, what type of organization can I use to help me understand it? Or is there an organization that works directly with specifically what you need and we don't? We need to really learn who is around us and who can help us support youth and work collaboratively to be able to do that. And understand too that this is a long game. It's not, one and done. It's not, a relationship takes time, and being able to really take your time with it, because there's youth that, if they don't trust authority, or if they don't trust certain people because of the situations they've been in, then maybe they won't be willing to talk for a while. And if we say, that's okay, and we're still here and our doors are open whenever you need and want to, and just reach out to me. If we're willing to do that, there's going to be more willingness to be able to come for services whenever they feel ready. We also need to understand that we're not required to ask certain questions. And what I mean by that is, if you don't feel genuine about asking a question, sometimes it's better to wait until you do. Because as Stephanie was saying earlier, children can see right through you, youth can see right through you. You can ask a question, and oftentimes as organizations, I see that we oftentimes ask questions just to check off boxes. I think about when you go to the doctor and they give you sheet asking about how you've been feeling in the past 2 weeks. Have you thought about this in the past 2 weeks? And there's times where I wonder, when do you really come up to someone and say, hey, I saw you check this off. Do you want to talk about it? Because I know I've personally have times where I think they're going to talk to me and they don't. So oftentimes I think, is this solely to check off a box, or do you genuinely want to know because you genuinely want to help me? Just because we don't have the answers to some of these questions, it doesn't mean that we can't work effectively with youth. We definitely can and will work effectively with youth, even if there's no confirmed CSAC case. However, it's really good to keep in mind, regardless, what kind of things to keep in mind as identifiers. There's some things that are physical that might be easier to identify. I mentioned earlier, like tattoo branding, or constant having a new phone, or like nail switch, getting nails done all the time, and we know that they can't afford it and their family can't afford it and they don't have a job, and who's giving this to them? But beyond the physical things, also just keeping in mind, when I feel like I can ask these questions, how am I going to go about it? There's so many ways to ask, and a good initial question is just saying, are you afraid of anyone right now? Or are you safe right now? We might also ask, has anyone ever forced you to do anything against your will? There's a lot of different ways that we can kind of hold this conversation. The most important thing to do is we have the acronym RELAX, which really just relax. R is rapport building. Relationship is the intervention, and that's the most important thing to be able to get through to a youth. Also expressing concern, but being genuine about it. As I mentioned, people can see right through you, and youth, especially who are very doubtful or very, they don't trust, or whatever the case, they're gonna be able to say, you don't care. So being able to express concern genuinely after that relationship has been up and running, building, is very important. Listening too, and not only listening, but listening and saying, okay, let's attune. What are we going to do now? And what do you want to do now? And what do you need? And just being able to build those steps is super important. Now we're going to move on to an activity just to tie it all in. Oh, sorry.
We will indeed move to the activity. I'll take us to that slide. And we'll give you all this information later. There we are. So now Adriana is going to take us through an activity again to be able to bring back everything that we've just talked about. So we'll be doing so through a Zoom poll. So yes, we have an ability to be able to interact with you a little bit. So she is going to read out the scenario and then the Zoom poll will come up and you'll get a chance to be able to select your answers.
Yes, thank you. Okay. So just keep in mind, as I read the scenarios, who you think is at highest risk of contracting or having HIV. George, I'm a young police officer. I'm married to my childhood sweetheart, and I have never had sexual intercourse with another woman. Mario, I am a 23-year-old man who moved here 1 year ago. I mostly have sex with men, and I identify as gay. Leanna, I am a 6-month-old baby. I have seen my mother shoot up daily since the day I was born. Mary, I am 16 years old, a straight-A student, and editor of the school newspaper. Caroline, I am involved in what people call prostitution. I don't use any drugs, and I always use condoms when I have sexual intercourse with a man. Junior, I am in love with Mary, but no one at school knows it. I'm not as popular or as smart as her. I don't go out much. So now we're gonna use the poll, and who do you think is at higher risk at the moment? And who do you think is at the lowest?
So we'll give it a few minutes. Go ahead and continue to submit your answers. So it looks like for the highest risk right now, we have Mario, who's in the leading, 43%. And the lowest risk looks like George. So we'll give you maybe a couple of seconds to go ahead and submit your answer. All right, Adriana, it looks like the poll has closed and it looks like Mario is a participant think that Mario is at higher risk of having HIV and George is at lowest risk. Do you mind also rereading the prompt for Mario and George for that first part, please?
Yes. So, George, I'm a young police officer. I'm married to my childhood sweetheart, and I have never had sexual intercourse with another woman. And Mario, I am a 23-year-old man who moved here 1 year ago. I mostly have sex with men, and I identify as gay. So now we're going to go ahead and read part 2 of this and then do another poll. So part 2, the second part of everyone's story. George, I have had sexual intercourse with Mario repeatedly over the last year. The more it happens, the more I think about leaving my wife and moving away to come out. Mario, The reason that I moved here is that my partner died of AIDS. I just need to start over in a new place. Leanna, my mother is diabetic. Mary, I'm very much in love with Junior. I sometimes have unprotected sex with him, especially if I've been drinking. Caroline, last night I had unprotected oral sex with George, the police officer, to get him not to arrest me. Junior, I am HIV positive from being raped a year ago. I know that I should tell Mary, but I'm afraid she won't see me again. I know that we should be using condoms, but the woman in the drugstore near me is my mother's best friend. So we're gonna go ahead and pull up the second part. And now who do you think is at highest or lowest risk?
Like it's moving between Mary and Junior for highest risk. The lowest was said Liana, because now we found out that second piece of information. Someone just messaged us in the chat and said Caroline, although Caroline does not have, it looks like we have one answer for Caroline. John, would you mind reading it again so we can give them one final chance to submit their answers, please? Thank you.
Yes. So starting from George, I have had sexual intercourse with Mario repeatedly over the last year. The more it happens, the more I think about leaving my wife and moving away to come out. Mario, the reason that I moved here is that my partner died of AIDS. I just need to start over in a new place.
Please, just remember I'm interpreting. Slow down, that's all.
Leanna, my mother is diabetic. Mary, I'm very much in love with Junior. I sometimes have unprotected sex with him, especially if I've been drinking. Caroline, last night I had unprotected oral sex with George, the police officer, to get him not to arrest me. And Junior, I am HIV positive from being raped a year ago. I know that I should tell Mary, but I am afraid she won't see me again. I know that we should be using condoms, but the woman in the drugstore near me is my mother's best friend.
Final responses, and we can close the poll in a few seconds. All right. It looks like it was almost a tie between Mary and Junior. Mary with 36% and Junior with 38% for highest risk, and Liana was lowest risk. And I think everyone agreed for the most part.
So thank you for participating in that. We don't have a 100% direct, like this is the highest risk answer. I know that there are definitely a couple people, obviously, that are at much higher risk than others. The importance of this activity is solely to keep in mind that we need to build that relationship. We might, from the get-go, see the first part of the story, and this goes for our clients. You might meet a child or a youth and say, this is who they are, based solely off what we can see, what we've been told, and so on. But it's important to really listen to them and ask questions and build that relationship to be able to see what their needs truly are, what they truly have gone through, how we can help. So this activity just shows us we really need to build relationship and listen and check our bias. I'm going to pass it on to Stephanie.
Thank you, Adriana. I love this activity because it does definitely check our biases. I know, I remember the first time I did this activity, when I read the second part, it definitely just like stood out for me. Again, because we've learned, right? There's a lot of learning and unlearning. So I know we just have a few minutes for questions. I wanted to highlight a couple of resources in organizations who are doing great work in the community around CSEC, Roxbury Youth Work, one of our partner agencies, right? They have their Gift and Build program, and their Build program focuses on providing services for cisgender youth, for cisgender male youth, gender nonconforming youth. And again, these services are so important, especially as we think about survivors who are at the margin. We also have Re-Rise, My Life, My Choice, who is one of our sub-grantee and provides a lot of our training. And also, if you're not as familiar with us, please do visit our website at the Center for Hope and Healing at chhinc.org. We'll also share out some additional resources with you at the end of this workshop. And then some other resources that I wanted to make sure that we point out are traffic cam, again, that Adriana mentioned, in working with law enforcement and being able to use crowdsourcing pictures to assist law enforcement in location of trafficking survivors, the National Human Trafficking Hotline. When folks call our hotline, this is definitely a resource that we provide to them in addition to the services that we provide. And then the Greyhound Home Free program that provides transportation to reunite homeless or exploited youth with their parent, guardians, or whatever the alternative arrangement is. And then our referral, we do have a specific referral for our Lowell Ending Trafficking of Youth program through the CHH website. So you can click on the page and under Survivor Services, you should be able to see our Lowell Ending Trafficking of Youth and put in a specific referral. And we also receive referrals for youth and adult survivors of sexual assault. So before we go ahead and give you our contact information, I would like to answer any question that the audience might have. Yeah, we'll give you some time.
Okay. So we have one question. I am confused about healthy sexuality in pop culture, such as Megan Thee Stallion and Cardi B. Please help. How do I talk to youth and check my bias?
AJ, do you want to take this one, or you leave it? Can you repeat the question again, Charlotte? I was confused.
I think it's just essentially, how do you talk to youth and check your bias when there's when the pop culture references can be a little bit conflicting?
Yeah. Well, I can take that and open it up, pass it on to Adriana for more. I definitely agree of just like, again, in working with youth, like everything that the media continues to portray, right? And culture is so important. And I've talked about different things that are also portrayed in the media, such as rape culture. However, when we think of artists like Cardi B and Megan Thee Stallion, they also mirror, I think a lot of times we think that it is an all or nothing, right? Both, they are empowering for a lot of youth and our cultures, especially in the Black community, that I can personally speak to that. And also a lot of, when he thinks of the bags, the jewelries and all of it, right? What that reality looks like for a lot of young people, again, who are seeing that information. We often just like build rapport and have these conversations of just like, what are their thoughts on these issues, right? Like, what is it about Cardi B or about Megan Thee Stallion that they particularly like? Because we cannot assume. I think one of the things is that we steer away from assumptions and allow young people to tell us as the expert of what is it that they're particularly interested or lured into, and also continue to debunk the myths, right? Because of what is reality and what are just like, Adriana talked about using the Zoom filters to be able to change our appearance. The same things of just like all of these pictures that Cardi B or Megan Thee Stallion might post, these pictures have filters, right? It's probably their 100 take of that one picture that they posted online. Really just having real conversation of this is what it looks like, right? And there also are real people, and also a lot of the messages continue to bring in the rape culture and how to empower them, talk about privilege and oppression, talk about self and identity, and what our culture is like. And I'll pass it on to Adriana if you wanted to add on.
Yeah, thank you. I think you said that perfectly. I think it's also important to highlight the fact that these are grown women who can consent. I know that, oftentimes youth try to kind of replicate what they see or so on, and being able to highlight that these women, if they feel empowered doing, whatever it is that they're doing, they're consenting to it. And I think that is incredibly important to highlight. And everything else Stephanie said is very important. Thank you, Steph.
We got a thank you from the person who asked that question. So thank you.
Thank you.
And so we have another question. My question is about age 18 being the age of consent. Knowing that the age of consent to sex in Massachusetts is 16, is 18 the age of consent to commercial sex because it is illegal for someone to contract for goods or services under 18? I can repeat that if you need as well.
I can just chime in there of, again, age 18 being the consent. And often Adriana and I do a training where we talk about developmental age and also developmental maturity around that. I think, just thinking about the sole age that any youth who is under the age of 18 cannot consent for sex. And also for commercial sexual exploitation, although, again, we talk about empowering survivors of just like, what does it mean for them? But as a young person, whether the age of consent we talked about around certain states, so in Massachusetts, it is 16, that perpetrators are still exploiting these different vulnerabilities, right? And I talked about adultification earlier. We talked about our Black and Brown youth, how they're hypersexualized, right? They're hypersexualized in the media with that previous question. They're hypersexualized in just like their own day-to-day life. So really just thinking that it is indeed a youth, and maybe that youth may have had different experiences of assault or abuse, like I mentioned earlier, that create a confusion around love, or what is around love and trust in a different lens or perspective. But a youth cannot consent, and if a perpetrator is indeed exploiting that youth, it is CSAC.
I also think about the fact that at 18 you can access other services in terms of economic help, financial help, being able to apply for certain jobs, and certain jobs are very specific age, and so on. So being 18 allows you to make more of a choice versus 16-year-olds who might not have access to be able to apply for certain benefits and so on.
Yeah, thank you for highlighting that, Adriana. So I think in terms of just thinking of it, the risk factors and vulnerabilities are so much wider for youth who are 16 in terms of what they have access or might have to depend on someone for, versus what they can actually seek out for themselves and give consent to. I hope that answered your question.
So we don't have any other questions at the moment. To those who are attending, if you have any final questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A function. We do still have a couple minutes, and we're happy to answer any other questions folks have. But thank you, Adriana and Stephanie, for this really great presentation. Really, really informative. And we will be sharing the slides as well as an exit survey link. I don't know if either of you wanted to put the exit survey link in the chat now. And we'll also be sharing a few resources about the Let Youth program in a follow-up email to everyone who attended today. And finally, MOVA does have a number of other trainings throughout the rest of April for Victim Rights Month. So I think Brenna is going to put a link in the chat to register for those if you're interested. She just did. And so if you want to attend those, please feel free to do so. You can find all of the rest of the upcoming trainings in that link she just posted. Okay, we have one more question. How do you think awareness can be brought to teens' attention on social media to prevent it before it happens?
That is actually a workshops that we do. Adriana and I facilitate together and having conversation. I mean, I cannot say this again, in building rapport, right? And the internet and just like social media in general is actually have a lot of benefits to it, right? Young people have been disconnected from their support system, from their friends. So social media is one way that they connect with each other, but talking about safety online is extremely important, right? Like Adriana mentioned, of just like bringing to their awareness that they can turn off their location. And if they do not turn it on, it's actually turn it off, it's actually on. Bringing to their awareness, again, tactics that perpetrators are using. Because I think for our young people, most of them think, just like a lot of us think, that trafficking or sex trafficking is not susceptible or it doesn't happen in our country, right? You also feel like they're not susceptible to this. The grooming process is not something that they are aware of. So having conversation, not just about trafficking or CSEC, but having conversation about privilege and oppression, having conversation about sex and identity, having conversation about healthy relationship. What does a healthy relationship look like? What feels healthy to you? What makes you feel safe? What is your idea of safety? I think all of these will contribute to the knowledge that youth already have to be able to navigate all these different social media platforms safely.
And I think too, bringing it to real life is so important. Like being able to share stories. I think it's very impactful when there are those examples that you can give, because oftentimes it becomes a thing of, oh, I've never met someone that's happened to, but if you can relate it to someone that, you know, this is a person that it happened to who was your age and this and that, it becomes a lot more of like, wow, this does occur. I know, for example, I forget exactly what the name of the documentary is, but it was on Netflix that I watched, and it involved a young woman from Lowell, and that is where our agency is from. So when I watched it, it was a big like, oh my God, it's out there. Other people will see that it's not something that's just occurring in other places. It happens here right now where we are. And I feel like when there is that reality of it, it's a lot easier for teens to be able to be open to that conversation and looking more into ways to prevent and awareness and so on.
So Stephanie did just put the exit survey link in the chat. We will also share that in the follow-up email that should be going out within the next couple of days at the very latest. But that's all the questions we have, and we're just about at 11:30 anyway. So thank you again, Stephanie and Adriana. And thank you everyone for attending today. I hope you all are able to attend some of our other upcoming trainings. Have a great rest of the day, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.
Everyone for attending. Please visit our website, Adriana's email, and I will be passed around with the resources that Charlotte will be sharing later on. And if you have any additional questions, we're always happy to connect. And again, we have different subcommittees that we can continue this work with you. Again, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you again. Bye.